Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every man, woman, or person's life where they must make the decision to either fight for the truth and stick to their guns or follow the masses and be a sheep simply because consensus says so. As you guys might have noticed on this channel, we've had a little bit of an Aggie and Longhorn back and forth. Mainly, it all started with the debate on Vince Young versus Johnny Manziel. And I truly believe, in my heart of hearts, in the deepest depths of my soul, that Johnny Manziel was and is a better college quarterback than Vince Young. And I'm here today to set the record straight for the final time. This will be my last video on the subject, unless, of course, there's some continued discussions or debates. But for me personally, I'm going to put this thing to bed after this video and move on to other topics. I've had a lot of Longhorn fans blowing up my comments the last couple days. They have no sense of humor. They enjoy hating the Aggies more than they do rooting for their own team, which is fine. They could do whatever they want. And also, just to be clear, this is for content. I know a lot of Longhorn fans and casuals are going to be sour at this video, which is fine. But if all you're going to say is A&M sucks or that VY was better, then I'm just not going to respond to it. It's not worth my time or energy. On the other hand, if you have something logical or reasonable to say, I will respond or give my 2 cents on it. But for everyone who's going to get upset at this video, it's just sports. It's not that serious. And once this video is done, I believe I will have swayed the masses. I'm going to absolutely destroy Vince Young's legacy and once and for all put Johnny Manziel over the top. I don't care what the masses say, the UT stands, the Vince Young stands. They're all wrong. They're flat out wrong. And I'm going to prove that here in this video. We are going to deep dive into the numbers, into the stats, into the winning, into the losing. We are going to look at their achievements, their averages, their peaks, their best and worst, their highs and lows. And at the end of this video, there will not be a shadow of a doubt that Manziel is better than Vince Young. So if y'all want to come and take this journey with me, then I invite you to come along. But if you do, you must keep an open mind. And you must be honest with yourself and be as objective as possible. And with that said, here we go. Now, before we begin, we must obviously lay down some ground rules. What are we going to be looking at, and how do we compare these two to each other? I will essentially be looking at stats, obviously, averages, peaks, career best, etc. I will be looking at the talent overall that they had around them. I will, of course, also be looking at who they played and how they performed against said teams. I am then going to break it down by how each played against the top 25, the top 10, and the top 5. I am also then going to add a second layer to who they played in terms of the defenses that they played. And when it comes to the rankings of teams, I will be looking at how they performed against teams who were ranked when they played them, and then what their stats actually were against the final rankings of every season in terms of teams that they played. Now, as if that wasn't enough for most people, the main argument that I am going to have to somehow address and get around is Vince Young's winning. Because let's be honest, this is an argument or a debate or a comparison of Vince Young's winning versus Manziel's stats. And I'm going to pull up their stats here, and we're just going to go ahead and get into it. As you can see here, the stats are not even close. Manziel essentially wins everything across the board. I understand that Vince Young's rushing totals and averages are better, but they're not that much better. And if Johnny Manziel had simply played one more year, he would surpass all of Vince Young's totals for the most part. Further, if we look into their career highs or the best that they ever did in a season at rushing, Manziel blows away anything that Vince Young did. Really, the only statistical category in rushing that Vince Young has over Manziel is his 7.4 average his freshman year. And as I said previously, if we simply look at the pace that Manziel had, he would have rushed for more yards, had more rushing TDs, and his average probably would have stayed about the same. So I will give Vince Young the career rushing average argument, and I will give him the nod on that stat. But obviously, in terms of quarterbacks, it's not even close. Manziel, of course, threw more than Vince Young. But again, if we look at the completion percentage, Manziel has a 7% better completion percentage, threw for way more TDs, and barely averaged more interceptions. And even with that being said, Manziel averaged an interception on every 40 attempts, while Vince Young averaged an interception on every 22 attempts, almost doubling his attempt to interception ratio. And Manziel's touchdown to interception ratio is about 50% better as well. Now, as you can see under Young's name, I took out his freshman year for his completion percentage and yards per year. And as you can see, it still is not anything close to what Manziel did in his 2 years, just to be as fair as possible. And to sort of stay on the topic of comparing the 2 years that both players started every game, Manziel's rushing totals, attempts, and averages are almost identical to Vince Young's 2 years as a starter rushing the ball. You could argue that Johnny Manziel was just as good, if not better, running the ball, with bigger highs and scoring the ball much more effectively than Vince Young did on the ground. So if we are simply just going to look at their stats on face value, and I understand that Manziel threw more, but his percentages and averages, his touchdowns, his rating, his interceptions, all of that taken into account, not to mention the fact that he had over 1,400 yards in 1 year with 21 TDs on the ground, which is greater than anything Vince Young did rushing. Simply looking at these stats, Vince Young is going to have to win this debate somewhere else. And in my debate with my friend Ian, he's my friend, I don't want to call him out, but this is also something that a lot of people say, is that, well, you can't look at the stats. So that being said, if we're just simply going off of stats, Manziel has not just won the stats, he blows Vince Young out of the water. And I think that needs to be taken into account. And people need to be objective whenever we talk about being a better quarterback. And usually where this discussion goes, or where it quickly pivots to, is Vince Young was just a better leader and a better winner. Now, I made a bit of a rebuttal video to this quote-unquote winning argument, and I think it's pretty flimsy. I have a few reasons for thinking this. In the video, I sort of explained how the college landscape is a little different than most other sports. And usually when we talk about winning, for example, in my other debates when I have argued that Michael Jordan is the GOAT, Michael Jordan plays in a salary cap league where the talent must be dispersed and spread out more for the most part. It is a much more even playing field than something like college football. A better comparison would be something like the MLB. Are the Yankees and the Red Sox and the Dodgers, are they better because they simply just want to win more? Are they better because they just are better quote-unquote leaders? No. They are buying the best talent year in and year out, and that's why they are always on the top of the pile, for the most part. This is a much better comparison to college football. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show the college recruiting classes that Vince Young walked into and had around him versus Johnny Manziel. Again, in college football, there really is no limit to the amount of talent that you can recruit and have around you. Now, unfortunately, I could only find recruiting class rankings all the way back to the year 2002, which would actually be Vince Young's class that he came to Texas. In 2002, Texas had the #1 recruiting class in the nation. In 2003, they had the 15th ranked recruiting class in the nation. And in 2004, they had the 10th ranked recruiting class in the nation. This puts them around a 7 or 8 recruiting class average for Vince Young's career. But of course, if you know anything about recruiting in college football, that #1 class that Vince Young was a part of means that they were probably hitting their stride and hitting their peak in 2004 and 2005. There should be a little bit of a weighted average taken into account with that. On the other hand, if we take a look at what Manziel had in terms of beginning with 2010 in the year he was recruited, A&M had the number 17th ranked class in 2010, the 27th ranked class in 2011, the 15th ranked class in 2012, and although it wouldn't really matter much, I went ahead and threw in 2013. A&M had caught a little momentum at this time, and they were number 11 in 2013 for Manziel's sophomore year. It should also be noted, though, that there were no 5 stars within that class for A&M, as good as it was. Now, I'm doing this to paint a picture, right? I'm trying to win this debate and win people over and win this argument, which is definitely an uphill battle. But so far, what I've done is I have established that Manziel definitely had better stats, more of a statistical output almost all across the board, and blows Vince Young away in terms of just looking at the cold hard data on paper. But again, this argument pivots to quote unquote Vince Young winning. What I am doing now is trying to paint the picture of the amount of talent and help that Vince Young had around him. Vince Young's average recruiting class that he had around him came in at about 8.5. Keeping in mind that Vince's class was a #1 class, meaning that when Vince Young was hitting his stride, so was all of the talent that was in that #1 class. And even further, A&M had an average recruiting class on the bookends of Manziel's career coming in at number 18. Also keeping in mind that their best class, the number 11 class that had no 5 stars, came at the end of Manziel's career, meaning he probably saw no benefit or very little benefit of that number 11 recruiting class. And the proof is in the pudding in terms of me making this point, because Texas in 2005 had 23 NFL-worthy players on their roster. Also keeping in mind that they lost 2 big players Vince Young's sophomore year in the likes of Cedric Benson at running back and Derek Johnson at linebacker. Meanwhile, Johnny Manziel's 2012 roster only had 15 players eventually go to the NFL, including 2 place kickers and 1 punter. Meaning Manziel really only had 12 positional players or major contributors in terms of the talent around him and what the team was built on, compared to Vince Young's 23, who the previous year had also lost Cedric Benson and Derek Johnson. Again, this is to prove the point that Vince Young had over twice the NFL talent than what Manziel did on that 05 roster compared to Manziel's 2013 roster. This is, of course, if we remove the 2 kickers and the punter, which I think is more than fair. Now, to stay on the topic of who had more help around them, I'm going to go to coaching, but I am not going to deep dive and compare Kevin Sumlin to Mac Brown. I think that one is pretty obvious, and Vince Young gets the nod on the coaching staff as well. To further illustrate my point about how each player had what respective talent and help around them, I am going to look at the 04-05 UT rushing stats, maybe a specific player or two, and their defensive team rankings, as well as the 2012 and 2013 Aggies. In 2004, minus Vince Young's rushing yards, the backfield combined for a total of 2,527 yards, mainly led by Cedric Benson, who was the number 4 rusher in the country that year. In 05, even though they lost Cedric Benson and they went to more of a running back by committee led by Jamal Charles, in 2005, they had 2,546 yards out of the backfield minus Vince Young's rushing totals. Even though they lost perhaps the best running back of the time that Vince Young had been there, the running back by committee led by Jamal Charles actually produced slightly more yards in 05. Meanwhile, in 2012, the Aggies had almost 800 less total yards on the ground out of the backfield minus Manziel, with 1,751. They then had about 900 yards less out of the backfield than the 05 Longhorns, when the 2013 Aggies, minus Johnny Manziel's rushing yards and totals, combined for 1,672 yards. Now, just to sort of compare the running backs, I'm using Sports Reference for college football. Year in and year out, they track about the top 250 to 300 rushers in the country. Cedric Benson, as I said, was number 4 in 2004. In 2005, Jamal Charles was number 63, along with 2 other running backs who came in at 168 and 183 respectively. In 2012, the Aggies had Ben Molina at number 95 and Christine Michael at number 218. So they were much lower in the rankings on average in 2012 than either 2004 or 5 compared to what Vince Young had. In 2013, the Aggies only had 1 rusher on the list of the top 286 rushers, in Ben Molina at number 156. Now we will go to the team defenses. In 2004, UT had the number 19th ranked defense, and in 2005, they had a top 10 defense coming in at number 9. The Aggies in 2012, their defense was ranked 26th, and in 2013, the Aggies had the 96th ranked defense. Again, I am not here to argue if the Aggies as a team were better than the Longhorns. Obviously, they were not for the 2 years that Manziel was there versus the 3 years that the Longhorns were there. I'm here to make the argument that Manziel was a better quarterback. And what I've done essentially now, before we get into sort of a game-by-game analysis of each quarterback and what they did against who, is I want to set the stage that across the board, in almost every facet of the game, in almost every position, minus perhaps Mike Evans at wide receiver, but again, how much of that was Manziel buying time, scrambling, giving him good throws, minus Mike Evans, Vince Young had way better talent and much more of it than Manziel ever had. The defensive comparisons and who they had, the Griffin brothers, Huff, Derek Johnson, what they had on offense in the backfield, Jamal Charles, Cedric Benson, were far superior than anything that Manziel had. And even when it comes to the offensive line, they were pretty similar. Texas actually had 3 offensive linemen during Vince Young's time that played quality minutes and played a lot of games with Vince Young. And they also had 2 tight ends, of which one was David Thomas, who was, I think, 2nd or 3rd in the running for the best tight end in the nation one year. A&M had 5 offensive linemen go to the pros under Manziel's time. So again, one of the arguments I heard was that A&M had a much, much better offensive line. Really, they're thinking of Luke Jokel and Jake Matthews, who definitely were 2 studs. But again, the running game was nowhere close. So just to recap, before we get into sort of the game-by-game statistics, and we're also going to talk about styles here a little bit, because Vince Young obviously ran the read option and the RPO. By the way, Manziel ran a lot of that also, but this is one of the arguments I heard in terms of why Vince Young did not put up the same stats. But just to recap, Texas had 2 or 3 times a better defensive team ranking. They had over twice the NFL talent. The offensive line is about the same when you throw in the 2 tight ends, which also sort of counteracts Mike Evans as well. They easily had better backfields, better backs. They easily had better coaching, and they easily had better draft classes. Again, to reiterate, I am not here to argue that A&M as a team was as good as the Longhorns in 04-05, and we'll talk a little bit about Young's freshman year as well coming up compared to Manziel in 2012-2013. I am not here to compare the teams. I am here to make the argument for Manziel being a better quarterback and what he achieved in college versus Vince Young. So before we get to the winning part and breaking that down and going on a game-by-game basis and looking at who they played and how they did versus who they played, I just want to set the stage that there is, without a shadow of a doubt, there's absolutely no doubt that Vince Young had 2 to 3 times the resources and talent, skill players, and production around him. And it's not even close. You could even argue it's more than that. But there really is nothing that Manziel had that was on par with Vince Young in terms of a team or a coaching staff or recruiting classes. And everything I've just laid out proves that. So now from here, we will go into looking at the games and who they played and how they did, and trying to do as good a job as we can in being honest and objective and comparing their performances against one another. So now that I think I've pretty thoroughly laid out that Johnny Manziel, overall, statistically speaking, was a better quarterback, with many of his averages, his highs, peaks, and overall statistical output, completion percentage, and scoring, as well as him having about half the talent around him, if not less, including his head coach and coaching staff, I'm now going to tackle the number one argument in this debate, and that is that Vince Young simply won more.
They tell some lies about college football, some big lies. Some are bigger than others, immunity, but I want to go down an entire list that I asked you to help me with last week, whenever June 19th was. It wasn't that long ago, actually. That was Monday, yeah. So I asked you guys, hey, what are some of the biggest lies that you think they tell about college football? Now, I gave you a few, and I've told you a few on this show for a long time. For example, I think the biggest lie in college football is you are what your record says you are. Because we simply know that's not true. In pro sports, it is true. In college football, I could be 10-2, you could be 12-0. That doesn't tell the whole story. You may have played just a list of tomato cans. I may have played 8 of the top 25 teams in the country. My 10-2 could be remarkably better than your 12-0. So you aren't always what your record says you are. But I've hashed that out with you 9 ways from Sunday. A win is a win. Technically is true, but in the grander scheme of things, that's also a lie. A win is a win, a loss is a loss. If I lose by 1 point to Georgia and you win by 1 point against Toledo, these are not the same things. I accomplished more than you did, and in the eyes of any rational committee member at the end of a year when we're trying to seed a playoff system, I think they would see it as such. But sometimes you get the old bumper sticker fortune cookie mentality of, nope, if it doesn't fit perfectly in a soundbite or on a screenshot, it doesn't make sense. People think that way in politics, they think that way in college football, they think that way in life, and most of the time, it's not true. So those are 2 of the big lies we talk about all the time. Now,
and to give some context to refuting this argument or how I'm going to go about doing this, I'm going to quickly go back to the Michael Jordan analogy in basketball. In basketball, you are on a smaller court, only 1 of 5 players on your team, 10 total, and you play both offense and defense. What does this mean exactly? This means that I can more transparently see, more accurately tell, and have a much easier one-to-one comparison in terms of how much does one's impact on a game equal to them being the main contributor in a win, or at least one of the main contributors in a win. I can see Michael Jordan's points, rebounds, steals, his defense, the eye test, hitting clutch shots, etc. And in a game with fewer players on a smaller court in which they play all over the field of competition, it is much easier to see and tell and translate what that person is doing in terms of them being quote-unquote responsible for a win or being one of the main drivers in terms of their team winning. If we look at a sport like football, there are 22 players on the team if we're just going to look at offense and defense. Vince Young only plays on 1/2 of that dichotomy. Further, he really is only responsible for 1/2 of the offense in terms of throwing the ball. Now, luckily for us, both Manziel and Vince Young are dual threat quarterbacks, and we can compare their running and throwing. And essentially where I'm going with this is I'm going to use what percentage did Vince Young have of his total team's offense. And obviously I'm doing this to sort of logically lead you down the road and to make a point. If I were to tell you that in 2004 Vince Young had around or less than 50% of his team's total yards, which includes his running and throwing, and he had less than half of his team's total touchdowns, would that change your position or view of him, quote unquote, being a winner? In other words, if the rest of his team or the backfield or even the defense is essentially contributing over half to a win that really does not have much to do with Vince Young, is Vince Young still a winner in terms of this one-on-one debate and comparison with him and Johnny Manziel? Can we really give Vince Young just a blanket statement label such as, well, he's a winner, so therefore he's better than Johnny Manziel? I think when you sort of put it into context like this is where the him being a winner argument sort of begins to fall apart. Again, I can look at Jordan, and if he scores the most points, if he has 2 or 3 steals, he hits the big shot, he has 6 or 7 rebounds, he gets 4 or 5 assists, he's playing defense on the best player, or at least the first or second best player, he has the ball in his hands the most, the offense runs through him, etc., right? It's very easy and very clear that Jordan is the main driver in terms of his team winning. But again, if we look at Vince Young in football, if he is producing less than half of the yards of his team's total offense, and he is scoring less than half of their touchdowns, why exactly does he get credit for them, quote unquote, winning? Why does he get the benefit of the doubt in the argument against Johnny Manziel that he is simply just a winner and that's why he's better? When you start to look at it like this, you can see how him, quote unquote, being a winner doesn't really provide any context. And it doesn't really give us anything to sink our teeth into in terms of backing that up with proof or statistics, context, etc., and why he gets to be labeled a winner by himself. Again, Vince Young played on amazing teams loaded with NFL talent, teams that had a top 20 and a top 10 defense, teams that had an amazing coach in Mac Brown, teams that had amazing backfields in Cedric Benson and when Jamal Charles led them by running back by committee. Over 2,500 yards each season out of the backfield. And so when you tell me that Vince Young is a winner, I need more than just that. Because I could just say, well, Manziel produced more. Manziel threw for more yards. Manziel was a bigger part of his team's total offense. Manziel scored more. Manziel played against harder competition. Manziel had less talent around him. But if all you're going to do is simply hand wave that away, and your rebuttal is simply Vince Young was a winner, I think the argument and the rebuttal for Vince Young against Johnny Manziel, when you put it in that light, is very disingenuous. And it's also a little intellectually lazy. And I'm going to use 2 examples here in terms of games that were played back-to-back by Vince Young to sort of further illustrate my point. Against USC, Vince Young definitely has a right to be claimed the reason why they won that game. Over 400 total yards, no interceptions, 75% completion percentage, over 80% of his team's total offense, 3 TDs on the ground. You see here with this sort of statistical macro view of what he did, Vince Young definitely has a right, and you could make the argument, and I would not refute it, that Vince Young won the Rose Bowl in 2005, or 2006 technically. Not necessarily by himself, but he would be the main driver. He would be the main reason. He would have the biggest claim to why they won that game. Again, the defense, although the defense was okay, 38 points isn't exactly something to write home about, but USC was the number 1 or 2 offense, depending on how you break it down. They allowed 38 points. That's not necessarily horrible. It's not necessarily good either. And so the difference would be Vince Young. Vince Young's performance on the offensive end of the ball, his throwing and running, his statistical output, how much he was responsible for his team's total yards and their touchdowns. All of these things combined, you can see where it's pretty clear that Vince Young gets credit for that win. But let's go 1 week back. Texas plays Colorado in the Big 12 championship. And again, I'm just going to use these 2 games to sort of further drive home my point about how just simply giving credit to Vince Young for being a winner is very dishonest. It's disingenuous. I don't think it provides proper context. It's a lazy argument, and it's just not true on its face. And so looking at the Rose Bowl game, Vince Young had 84% of his team's total offense. He played amazing, no turnovers, 75% completion percentage, scores 3 times, takes Texas down on the final drive and wins. You can't really say the defense did enough to maybe be a game changer. Vince Young gets credit for that win, correct? Now, if we look at the game before that, the Big 12 championship game, I want us to be honest and say, did Vince Young, quote unquote, win this game? You see here the final score, 70-3. You would think, wow, someone must have really put up a lot of points. Vince Young must have dominated, something of that nature, correct? Vince Young went 14 of 17, good completion rate, only 193 yards. 3 TDs, 1 interception. You see a total of 4 TDs chipped in by other people, as well as about another 200 yards on the ground from everyone else. Not exactly a whole lot going on here on offense, technically, right? In terms of a 70-3 final score. Well, how did we get to that score, correct? We see here opening drive by Colorado, a fumble. We then look at the first drive by Texas, 7 plays, 65 yards, which means they got the ball at the 35-yard line. That's pretty good field position, all things considered. Vince Young has a couple nice passes. He really is the reason why they score on this first drive. Henry Melton punches it in for a touchdown. Next drive by Colorado, a punt. We then have an 8-play, 52 yards. So again, they started essentially at midfield. So far the defense and special teams has given Texas really good field position. All things considered. Vince Young, again, he has a decent drive here. Jamal Charles has the biggest play, an 18-yard rush. Colorado has a 15-yard penalty. And Vince Young throws a little 3-yard touchdown pass to Jamal Charles. Next drive, a field goal missed by Colorado. It was actually blocked. If you see here at the bottom, it was actually blocked by Texas. Then Vince Young throws an interception. So, I mean, if you're going to give him credit for a touchdown, he gets penalized for the interception. Colorado comes down the next drive and they score a field goal. And largely this field goal is Vince Young's fault. So if we're going to give him credit for the touchdown, he gets penalized for an interception. These 3 points right here are really on him. As you can see, they went 4 plays, -3 yards. So the defense really did their job, and Colorado is essentially able to kick a field goal from about 25 yards out. So again, those points that Colorado scored are on Vince. We then have a rushing touchdown. Again, Texas gets the ball across midfield, only has to go 46 yards. Vince has a couple nice passes, and he runs it in for a 2-yard touchdown. Then we see the defense comes up again. Big interception on the first play, and they return it all the way to the Colorado 31. So only 31 yards. Vince Young hooks up with Limas Swede for a 31-yard touchdown. Again, Vince Young capitalizes, but if we're really going to give credit to where the offense is getting the ball, the momentum that is being built in the game, so far the defense has come up huge. They blocked a field goal. They held them to 3 points when they had it in their territory after a Vince Young interception. They've gotten 2 turnovers, everything else being a punt. They've gotten the offense the ball essentially at midfield for most of Texas' possessions. So you see here, after the punt by Colorado, the next drive, they only have to go 44 yards. And most of it is done on a Vince Young pass to Limas Swede. And then Vince Young throws a little pass to the tight end David Thomas for 8 yards and a touchdown. Colorado punts again. Then we have their longest drive, 9 plays, 71 yards. And the biggest play of this drive comes from Selvin Young at the Colorado 23, a 19-yard rush. And Jamal Charles punches it in from 2 yards out. Then we have the end of the half. Texas has their next longest drive, 68 yards. Vince Young has a nice little 17-yarder to Quan Cosby. We then have 2 rushes by Taylor back-to-back. Vince Young has a 14-yard rush, another rush by Taylor, another rush by Taylor. Then the biggest play of the drive is another 19-yard scamper by Selvin Young. And Selvin Young then puts it in from 4 yards. So running game, again, did most of the work on that one. Just for reference, just to be transparent and clear about it. We have another punt by Colorado. Another play here made by defense and special teams. They return the punt for a touchdown. Colorado, the defense forces a fumble again on Colorado. We then have a one-play, 26-yard drive, which is essentially Jamal Charles, 26 yards rushing for a touchdown on one play. So obviously he gets credit for that one. Then we have another fumble by Colorado. Texas only has to go 16 yards. Essentially everything is a rushing play from the backfield, and Henry Melton puts it in from 1 yard out. Then we have 3 straight punts, Colorado, Texas, Colorado. Texas goes for a 4th and 3 at the Colorado 20. They don't get it, turnover on downs. Then we have a punt and another punt, and then a turnover on downs by Colorado, and it's the end of the game. So again, and I'm just using this game as a contrast to the Rose Bowl game, correct? If we were going to say that Vince Young won the Rose Bowl, which I would not argue, this is where I can be honest about what happened and what I'm seeing and use the same standards across the board. If we were going to say that Vince Young, quote unquote, won the Rose Bowl, which I think he, for the most part, did. I mean, obviously no one wins alone, but if you were going to say who won that game, Vince Young gets most of the credit. When we look at a game like this, right, contrasted to a game like the Big 12 Championship the week before, understanding essentially that the 3 points that Colorado scored were not really even on the defense, that with their punt return alone, they would have won the game. The fact that Texas caused 4 turnovers and gave Texas the ball at midfield or better on 8 of their possessions that allowed Texas to score touchdowns. Again, who would you say won this game, correct? If you had to sort of pick the X factor, who won this game? It's not Vince Young, it's the defense. It is, I wouldn't say 100%, nothing's 100%, right? But the main factor in this game was the defense. The defense, quote unquote, won this game, correct? And so when people say Vince Young was a winner, well, if we actually get into a game-by-game basis, you would actually see that that's not true. That's just not how it works. That Vince Young was not just this offensive monster that people remember in the Rose Bowl. And that's honestly where I think Vince Young's lore has ballooned out to such a massive point that people simply remember the Rose Bowl and they think Vince Young did that every game. And I hate to tell people, but Vince Young's statistical output and how much he had of his team's total offense, how much he scored of his team's total TDs, is not that impressive. It's not. His touchdown to interception ratio is negative. He essentially averaged under 200 yards passing against better competition and ranked opponents. He was benched in his first bowl game against Washington State. He was benched against Missouri his sophomore year. His rushing totals and yards, again, he got to run the RPO. That's one of the arguments. His rushing totals and yards are essentially on par with Johnny Manziel, even though Manziel scored even more on the ground and had a bigger statistical rushing year his freshman year than Vince Young ever did. Again, when people say Vince Young was a winner, Vince Young won, there's no context to that. They are being lazy with their arguments and is simply looking at what the team achieved and sort of piggybacking Vince Young's success onto that to act as if he was this statistical monster that got over 400 yards every game like he did in the Rose Bowl, scored 4 touchdowns with no turnovers, something of that nature, and essentially was just putting Texas on his back for 2 years straight when he went on his incredible run as a quote-unquote winner, right? And just as we can see in these 2 games here as an example, that's not how it is. And one thing I will add about the context of games, and this one will actually apply to the entire 2005 season for the Longhorns. In that 2005 season, I have also heard that Texas had the number 1 offense. In reality, they had the number 1 scoring offense. And here in just a moment in the next segment, I'm going to show you the percentage of Vince Young's total offense and total TDs that he was responsible for. And in terms of having that number 1 scoring offense, it was largely led by their backfield in terms of having over 2,500 yards and scoring over half of their total touchdowns. Secondly, in terms of total offense per game, Texas was number 3 in yards. If we break that into rushing and passing, Their rushing yards per game was number 2. Their rushing TDs per game was number 1. However, their passing yards per game was number 40 and 22nd in passing TDs per game. So again, the rushing game is obviously being the biggest driver here of their offense on a more consistent basis and game in and game out, and plays a more integral part than Vince Young's throwing. Now, I understand Vince Young also ran for a decent amount. In 2005, he averaged just under 81 yards per game. But keep in mind that Texas averaged 275 yards per game on the ground. Therefore, his backfield is giving him 200 yards a game in terms of the most consistent and productive part of their offense. Meaning that other players on his team are largely contributing more in what is the driving force of their offense. In fact, his sophomore year, he only had around 50% of his team's total offense. He scored less than half of his team's total TDs. And in his junior year, his best year, he only had 61% of his team's total offense and still had under half of his team's total TDs. And just so everyone can understand how much help or how much other people contributed during Vince Young's career, correct? We've already brought up the number 19 and 9 ranking respectively for the Horns in terms of their defense, which again, having a top 10 defense, even a top 20 defense, is still better than anything Manziel had. He had 50% of his team's total offense in 2004, 61% of his team's total offense in 2005. In 2004, Vince Young scored a total of 26 touchdowns, running and throwing. And if we simply look at what the backfield produced for the Longhorns in comparison, other touchdowns on the team in which Vince Young did not contribute at all totaled to be 27 total touchdowns. So again, he had less than half of his team's total touchdowns in 2004. In 2005, Vince Young had a total of 38 touchdowns. So wow, you think 38, I mean, that's almost a 50% increase essentially. What did the rest of the team score that Vince Young did not play a part in? They had 43 touchdowns out of the backfield alone. And just for reference, just so everyone knows, having 61% of your team's total offense in terms of being a dual threat quarterback, a very efficient, high producing dual threat quarterback, or just quarterback alone, 61% is not that good. And again, 61%, we'll just say 60%, right? 60 to 40 in terms of you just being classified as a winner with a top 10 defense and your backfield scoring more touchdowns than you ran or threw. Again, why does Vince Young get to have the winner label put onto him to just make a blanket statement that he's better than Johnny Manziel? It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. On the other hand, when we look at Johnny Manziel, in 2012, his Heisman season, he had 69% of his team's total offense. In 2013, he had 73% of his team's total offense. Now, just to be clear, right? If Vince Young was getting 70% of his team's total offense, and if he was doubling up the touchdowns that everyone else on the team scored, the argument would be over, right? This is what I mean where I'm trying to be as consistent as possible, right? If the stats were close, if Vince Young was essentially offensively putting his team on his back, if he had maybe just an average defense, right, then the term Vince Young being a winner would hold a lot more weight. But it just doesn't when you look at what he did over his entire career. And for the record, Manziel scored a total of 47 touchdowns that he either threw or ran in 2012. The rest of the team had 27 total TDs. So again, he's almost doubling up the rest of the TDs that everyone else had. In 2013, Manziel had a total of 46 touchdowns, and the rest of the team had 27 touchdowns. Again, doubling up the team total of touchdowns again. So using these numbers, I just am trying to paint the picture of why saying Vince Young is a quote-unquote winner is not a valid argument when saying he is better than someone. He was not a winner per se every game, not even close. And so therefore, he shouldn't get all of the credit that his team essentially did about half the time, if not more. And if we throw in defensive plays, special teams, etc., Vince Young essentially had under half of his team's total offense in terms of yards his sophomore and junior year, and he definitely scored under half of their total points. So the claim that Vince Young is a winner does not hold up to scrutiny, and the stats prove it. Again, this is context. This is digging a little deeper into what Vince Young actually did, and understanding that this blanket statement that Vince Young was a winner is just simply not true. Was it true at times? Absolutely. Vince Young had some amazing games from time to time, and you could argue that he was the reason they won. But just simply calling him a winner over a 3-year span in comparison to Johnny Manziel to say that's why he's better is not a valid argument. And so now let's look a little more into what these two players did against said competition, because again, one of the other arguments, now that I've tackled Vince Young, quote unquote, being a winner, is that Vince Young played better against better competition, or that he was a gamer, or that in big moments, Vince Young just simply was better than Johnny Manziel. Really, where this stems from is the 2 Rose Bowl appearances, right? Essentially, Vince Young ran his ass off and was largely, although not so much in the Michigan game, definitely in the 2005 Rose Bowl, right? Vince Young statistically was very dominant on the ground, and you could say that was the difference in the game in terms of them winning, and Vince Young deserves a lot of credit for that. But again, these 1 or 2 games, correct, do not make Vince Young a better quarterback than all of Johnny Manziel's career. And to not look at each of their complete bodies of work in terms of this debate and argument is doing the topic a disservice. So let's look at what they did in terms of against who. And for the record, the 2005 Longhorns strength of schedule ranked 23rd in the nation. The 2004 Longhorns ranked 23rd in the nation in terms of strength of schedule. The 2013 Aggies ranked 22nd in terms of strength of schedule, and the 2012 Aggies ranked 20th in terms of strength of schedule. And in 2003, the Longhorns were even further away than that, or even lesser ranked. But again, very close. The strengths of schedule are very close, but we're going to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty here with who they played against. Now, the accusation has also been leveraged that Johnny Manziel played a few non-Power 5 schools, which is fair. But again, if you remove those games, right, A&M's strength of schedule would go up even more. And further, neither of these players ever lost to a team that was not in the top 25. So I think that should be mentioned. That's largely what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at the top 25, top 10, top 5, and very highly ranked defenses that they played against, as well as bowl games, etc. However, it should be noted that Vince Young's sophomore year, he was pulled in the Missouri game because he was so bad. Essentially had a 6.6 rating, a negative yards per attempt. He had 2 interceptions, and he had one of them returned for a touchdown, I believe. So again, in my book, in my opinion, and for the sake of this argument, I see that as a loss, in my opinion. If you get benched, even though Chance Samot came in and they barely beat Missouri his sophomore year, in my eyes, that's a loss for Vince Young. It might not be a loss on the scoreboard, and history won't show that, but to give context to that game, he was pulled in the Missouri game, and he was benched, and they won that game, but I count that as a loss for Vince Young, just to be transparent and clear. In his freshman year, he was also pulled against Washington State in the bowl game, and he did not do very well in that game either. Now, in terms of the teams I'm going to look at for Vince Young got his first start his freshman year against Oklahoma, which was the 6th game of the year. In the game prior, he did not start, although he had the game-winning drive where he punched it in from 1 yard out against Kansas State for the win. He should get some credit for that. His statistics are such a small sample size, and he didn't necessarily do that well throwing the ball. I think he had about 80 yards rushing and a touchdown. I am not going to count that game. But just to be clear and upfront, if people want to look at my numbers and then go back and add that game or have something to say about it, you're more than welcome. So what I've done is I went through, starting with the Oklahoma game in 2003 on October 11th. I've gone through and I will count all the teams that were ranked in the top 25 when they played them. And then I will also go back through and look at the teams in the top 25 in terms of final ranking. So if you played a team that wasn't ranked at the time, but then they eventually became ranked, I will do 2 different subsets of stats for that. I'm also going to look at how they did against top 10 defenses. And just to get a sort of quick snapshot of the level of competition that they played, and I'm using the game from Vince Young's freshman year when he played Oklahoma all the way to USC. Vince Young played 12 ranked games that were in the top 25 when they played them. Again, keeping in mind that Oklahoma State fell out of the top 25 twice during Vince Young's career, and A&M fell out of the top 25 as well. But they were also replaced by Texas Tech one year and Oklahoma his junior year. So he played a total of 12 ranked games versus top 25 when they played them, and a total of 11 ranked games in the top 25 in terms of the final rankings. And again, this is a 3-year, we'll call it a 2.5 year, right? Again, from the Oklahoma game for Vince Young compared to Manziel. So that means that Vince Young played about 6 or 7 more games. Johnny Manziel played 11 ranked games against the top 25. And technically, Louisiana Tech and Mississippi State fell out of the top 25 his freshman year. But in his sophomore year, Vanderbilt actually jumped into the top 25, which I thought was kind of funny. They actually had an okay season there, I think, for a couple years. In terms of top 10 games, Vince Young played 5 top 10 teams. We can make that 6 if we want to throw in Washington State in terms of their final rankings. But also keep in mind that Texas Tech fell all the way to 20 in the final rankings as well. And then if we look at Manziel's 2 years that he played, he actually played a total of 6 top 10 teams if we want to include the final rankings. In his freshman year, Florida ended up at number 9, and Auburn his sophomore year ended up at number 2. He also played Bama both years. LSU in 2012 was number 6 when they played, and then Missouri in 2013 was actually number 5, believe it or not. And technically LSU his freshman year did fall out of the top 10, but they ended up at number 14, so not a huge skid. So again, when looking at the averages in terms of what they played each year so far, looking at the top 25 and the top 10, Manziel is playing about 1 or 2 more games or ranked games every year than what Vince Young did on average. In terms of top 10 defenses, we're going to go ahead and include Oklahoma's defense his sophomore year, which finished number 11. That would give Vince Young 4 top 10 defenses that he faced during his time at Texas. And then we're going to include LSU at number 12 for Johnny Manziel his sophomore year. So that would also give him 4 top 10 defenses. So they're very even across the board in terms of the overall, let's just call it top tier talent. If you're top 25 in anything or even top 10, they're very, very similar with the amount of competition that they played. Keep in mind with the caveat that Manziel only played 2 years, and a few of these games are included in Vince Young's freshman year. Again, if we were to remove Vince Young's freshman year, again, I'm not saying I am. I think it's more than fair to include it. Because again, if you're a winner, right? Doesn't matter. If you want to do a sort of yearly average, Johnny Manziel is facing about 1 or 2 more top 25 to top 10 teams, as well as a top 10 defense in there, just to be clear. So for all of those who say that Johnny Manziel didn't play anybody or they had some kind of cupcake schedule, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and that's just not the facts of the matter. On average, Manziel played about 1 or 2 top-ranked or top-tier teams than what Vince Young did. And so for Vince Young, I've gone through and I've crunched the numbers. I'm going to do passing attempts, completions, total passing yards, TDs to interceptions, rushing totals, rushing TDs, and their overall rating. I'm also going to look at what percentage of their team's total offense did they have. And so for the top 25 when they played them in 2003, I have Oklahoma, Nebraska, who also had a top 5 defense that year, Oklahoma State, and Washington State in the Holiday Bowl at the end of the year. For that year in 2003, Oklahoma State did fall out of the top 25 rankings, just for reference. And although Washington State was ranked 15th at the time they played, they did finish the year number 9, so that will be 2 different subsets I will use for Washington State. in terms of teams they played that were top 25 when they played them, and then I will also use them in my top 10 in terms of how they did. I will also then remove them from the top 10 because that was a final ranking, right? They were number 9 is what they finished in. So I will give both with Washington and without Washington State. Again, that actually is a big help to Vince to see what the difference was. In 2004, in terms of when they played them, I have Oklahoma at number 2, Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, and then they played Michigan in the Rose Bowl, who was 13 at the time. In terms of final rankings, again, you have Oklahoma State falling out of the top 25 as well as A&M. In 2005, we have Ohio State at number 4, Colorado, who would eventually fall out of the top 25, as well as, actually, believe it or not, I couldn't believe this, but Oklahoma was actually not ranked the fifth game of the year, and then they would eventually be number 22 at the end of the year for 2005. Then you have Texas Tech coming in at number 10 actually when they played them, although they fell all the way to number 20. Then you have them playing Colorado again. At this time, they were not ranked. They had fallen out of the top 25 rankings, so it won't count. And then we obviously have USC in the Rose Bowl at the end of the year. Okay, so let's get into the numbers that we found here. Looking at top 25 rankings when Vince Young actually played them, Vince Young had a total of 12 games in which he played top 25 competition. His total record against top 25 competition at the time when he played them was 9-3. Again, in my opinion, I think the Missouri loss, although Missouri was not ranked, goes on Vince Young as well. So if you wanted to put him at a 9-4, I think that's fair. Against currently ranked top 25 competition, he went 173 of 273 for 63% completion, 183 passing yards on average. He threw .75 TDs to .92 interceptions, so a negative touchdown to interception ratio, 106 rushing yards on average, 1.3 TDs on the ground, a 131 rating, and 63% of his team's offense. For the final ranked opponents in the top 25, so essentially we will be dropping the 2 Oklahoma State teams, Texas A&M 1 year and Colorado in 2005, I believe. We will be adding Texas Tech in 2004 and Oklahoma in 2005. Against the final ranked top 25, again, he went 7-3 against these teams, 7-4 if you want to count that Missouri game that he was benched. He went 133 of 234 for 57%, 164 average passing yards, a 1-to-1 ratio on touchdowns to interceptions at 0.9 to 0.9, 111 rushing yards, 1.4 TDs on the ground, and just under a 116 quarterback rating, with a slight bump in his team's overall offense at 64%. Slightly dropping across the board, which I think is accurate. I think this makes sense when you think about it. Again, I think the final rankings of top ranked teams, top 25, if you will, is more accurate than the preseason polls, in which, again, no matter what conference you're in, right, you tend to play a little easier games in the beginning. If you win those, you'll still be ranked if you were ranked preseason. So it's not always indicative of how good a team is. Over the 3 years that he played, he had 4 teams drop out of the top 25 and 2 that then were ranked at the end of the year. For the next subset of top 10 teams, I slightly misspoke earlier. We're going to do the top 10 teams that Vince Young played while they were ranked. That would be 2 Oklahoma teams, Ohio State, USC, and Texas Tech was actually a top 10 team. I kind of forgot about them when I spoke earlier in the video. So I will do the top 10 with those 5, and then I will do a top 10 of the final rankings, which means that same Texas Tech team will fall out, and I will replace them with Washington State. So if we want to look at how Vince Young did against top 10 competition, he technically had a 3-2 record if we don't count the Washington State game. 2 wins coming by way of Ohio State and USC his senior year, as well as the Texas Tech game when they were ranked. Again, they would fall out of the top 10, though, all the way to number 20. And 2 of his losses coming to Oklahoma his freshman and sophomore year. And if we wanted to count the Washington State game, that would be a top 10 loss as well. So if you wanted to say he was 3-3 against top 10 opponents, that's probably not too far off. Against those opponents, not counting the Washington State game yet, we're just going to count Ohio State, USC, the 2 Oklahoma games, and Texas Tech. He went 79 of 135, 59%, 199 yards on average, 0.8 touchdowns thrown compared to 1.2 interceptions. So again, Vince Young in all of these ratings so far has either had a 1-to-1 or a negative touchdown to interception ratio. 100 yards averaged on the ground, 1 TD averaged in these top 10 games, 1 rushing TD on average, a rating of 118, and 73% of his team's total offense. If we count the Washington State game and we drop the Tech game, he is 57% on his throws, 155 yards through the air on average, a 1-to-2 ratio of TDs thrown to interceptions at 0.4 to 0.8, 101 yards rushed on the ground on average, 0.8 TDs on the ground on average, and a rating of 97 with 67% of his team's total offense. So let's get into Johnny Manziel stats against the same kind of competition, correct? He goes 278 of 418, 67%, an average of 310 yards a game. He has 2 touchdowns to 1 interception average, 92 yards rushing on average, essentially just a shade under 1 rushing touchdown a game, 150 QBR, and 81% of his team's total offense. If we look at what he did against the final ranked top 25 teams, it's essentially the same. 66% completion percentage, a 1% drop, 301 yards, a 9-yard drop. He actually goes up on his throwing touchdowns to interception ratio at 2.3 to 1, so 2.5 to 1. That's pretty good. 71 yards rushing, drops off a bit. Half a touchdown on the ground, 151 QBR, and still around that 81% of his team's total offense. It drops to 80% against the final ranked top 25. If we look at what Manziel did against top 10 competition when he played them, 105 of 161, 65%, 297 yards passing on average, almost a 2-to-1 ratio at 2 touchdowns to 1.25 interceptions per game, 60 yards on the ground, 145 QBR, no rushing TDs, and 82% of his team's total offense. But essentially, he's keeping his numbers consistent against top 10 ranked opponents. In terms of final top 10 rankings, he goes 73% completion percentage, 308 yards passing on average, a 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, 2.4 to 0.8, 64 yards on the ground, almost half a touchdown rushing, 164 QBR, and 81% of his team's total offense. Then I also looked at what they did against top 10 defenses. They each played 3 top 10 defenses, with the caveat that I'm going to throw in Oklahoma from Vince Young's sophomore year, which was ranked number 11 in terms of a team defense. And I'm going to throw in LSU from Manziel's freshman year, who was ranked number 12, just to get a bigger sample size than just 3 games each. Against top 10 defenses, Vince Young went 45 of 88, 51%, 140 passing yards, a 1-to-3 touchdown to interception ratio at 0.5 to 1.5, 105 yards on the ground on average, half a TD rushing, and a 92 QBR. He also accounted for 69% of his team's total offense. Manziel against top 10 defenses went 104 of 156 for a 67% completion percentage, 292 yards through the air, 1.75 touchdowns to 1.25 interceptions, so still staying in the positive and averaging half a touchdown more per interception. 69 yards on the ground. He only got 1 touchdown in those 4 games, so he comes out with a 0.25 average touchdowns rushing. 145 QBR, and 79% of his team's offense. And then one more stat I did, again, I'm trying to build my case here, right? Who's a better quarterback? Against the top 25 ranked teams that they played, Vince Young threw an interception every 25 attempts, which is pretty bad to say the least. Manziel threw one interception every 38 attempts, and this is against top 25 ranked teams. And for that same stat, but against the top 10 defenses we just went over, Vince Young throws an interception every 15 attempts against top 10 defenses. Manziel throws an interception every 31 attempts against top 10 defenses. Again, twice as good against the best defenses in the country. And then, although it doesn't matter, but it is one more little piece to the puzzle, I went ahead and looked up their Wonderlic scores. I was just curious. You know, I kind of see that Vince Young does not have a very good INT to attempt ratio, touchdown to attempt ratio throwing the ball. And so I kind of became a little curious. Vince Young has one of the worst Wonderlic scores of all time at a 6, single digit 6. Manziel, I believe, got a 32 or 35. He was the highest ranked in terms of his draft class on the Wonderlic score. And again, I only just throw this. It's just a little cherry on top. I know it doesn't really matter, so don't come at me with, you know, who cares about the Wonderlic. But again, we're talking about quarterbacks, and for those who want to complain about styles and things like that, I think the bottom line is that Vince Young simply could never throw attempts like Manziel and lead any sort of an efficient offense. If you really go back and look at Young's games, I mean, essentially his big games that people remember, he did it on the ground, right? Vince Young does not really have any dominant passing games really to speak of at all against any kind of decent competition. There's maybe one or two, of course. Manziel regularly put up 350, 400 yards on good teams. In just the 2 Bama games that he played against them, he threw 253 in the win his freshman year. He put 464 yards on Bama his sophomore year. They lost that game, 5 touchdowns to 2 interceptions, also 100 yards on the ground. And even against Auburn, who finished number 2 that year, he put up 454 yards through the air. In all of these games that Vince Young played against top 25 competition, he only broke 300 yards one time, and that was against Colorado, a very bad Colorado team, might I add. And again, I know that he runs the RPO, the read option, but again, if Mac Brown thought he could air it out with Vince Young, then he would have. And they also had an amazing backfield, which allowed Vince to rely and lean on those guys even more. And if Vince Young had to air it out, he simply can't. And as much as people want to say, well, that's not his style, I mean, that's fine. But even on the ground, Manziel is right there with him. And so no matter how you want to slice it and dice it, in terms of simply just airing the ball out, don't even mention attempts or perhaps even total yards, but just inefficiency. Interceptions per attempt, touchdowns to interceptions, completion percentage, quarterback rating, all of these things, right? Manziel is just simply a better thrower than Vince Young could ever dream of being. And however much you want to say that Vince Young is a better runner, if he is, it's not by much. It is by the smallest of margins. And really, in the 2 big games, the 2 Rose Bowl games that Vince Young sort of took over and dominated, it was on the ground. And I mean, look, a win's a win. I'm not going to take that away from him. But I've said this previously. I think that when people think of Vince Young, they think of those 2 Rose Bowl games, mainly the USC game, and they think that Vince Young did this week in and week out, and he simply didn't. In total, Manziel is averaging about 100 more yards per game, much more efficient, 1 more TD just about than Vince Young. Best case scenario, Vince Young is averaging a little under 2.5 touchdowns to 1 interception, and that's total touchdowns running and passing. Manziel is more in the 3-to-1 or even higher average. And largely for the most part, against these ranked teams, these top 10 ranked teams, these defenses, Manziel's averaging around 300 yards, 3 TDs to 1 interception, 3 total TDs passing or running, and a high 60 to 70% completion percentage. Vince Young, on the other hand, is hanging around the 60% completion percentage area, 50% against top 10 defenses. And if we give him the 1 touchdown on the ground that he's essentially averaging, he's not even averaging over 1 touchdown through the air in terms of passing, while also averaging about 100 yards less total per game. And with that, I'm going to kind of roll into my summary here. And what this last segment, what we did and what we proved is that as a quarterback, Johnny Manziel, against largely the same amount of competition, although again, I would argue on a year-by-year basis, Manziel was playing one more elite defense, one more top-tier competitor. Johnny Manziel has essentially achieved, statistically, much more than Vince Young did against better competition with half the talent. And I've also addressed Vince Young's quote-unquote being a winner. Again, if you are getting around half or less of your team's total yards and total points, why do you get to call yourself a winner when you're not even doing half the work or near as much of the work as Manziel? Again, Vince Young is hanging out around the mid to high 60s in terms of team production against these ranked teams or total offense. Manziel is easily going over 80% every single game against ranked opponents. And if we can address Manziel's losses for a second as well, remember his freshman year, they only lose 2 games. One of those games being his first game ever, they lose by 3 points to Florida, who ended up being ranked number 9 that year and had a 5th ranked defense at the end of the year. Again, I'm not making excuses, but as always, context matters. I would say the same for Vince Young in terms of playing Oklahoma. The only difference being, in terms of their kind of first starts, is Vince Young had seen action before. He had played in all 5 games leading up to that, and they got smoked against Oklahoma in their first start. Manziel lost by 3. They then go on a roll, and they lose to LSU. Now, I don't know what it is about LSU, but they had Manziel's number for his 2 years while he was at A&M. 19-24, they lose by 5. We're talking about 2 losses for Manziel against teams that would end up being ranked number 9 and 14 in the nation at the end of the year, a 5th ranked and 12th ranked defense, and he lost by a total of 8 points. And then he goes out and he absolutely thumps Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl in his first bowl game, whereas Vince Young got benched against Washington State, no less. And Oklahoma was ranked slightly higher than Oklahoma State at the time, number 12. Washington State was 15. So Manziel, his first year, in terms of his first, let's just say 13 games or 13 starts versus Vince Young, was much better, won more, was a better quote-unquote winner and leader, was doing more for his team against better competition. And then if we go to Manziel's sophomore year, again, the record, not necessarily the best. They lost 4 games. But again, let's dive into the 4 games real quick. He beats Bama the year before. Bama then comes back into A&M. And again, A&M has the 90th plus ranked defense or whatever it was. Bama's able to put 49 points on the defense. Manziel goes out and throws 5 touchdowns to 2 interceptions, and they lose by a touchdown, 7 points. To say that Manziel didn't do his job against Bama, you'd be lying through your teeth. They ended up being 7th that year in the final rankings, a 4th ranked defense, and he hangs 42 on them. Their next loss is then to Auburn. Again, Manziel puts 41 points on Auburn. Auburn would end up being the 2nd ranked team in the nation at the end of the year. He lost by 4 points. Again, the defense doesn't show up at all. They then lose to LSU, who would end up being number 14 in the nation, 21 ranked defense. No excuses on this one. Manziel loses 10-34. That one I don't have any excuses for. He just lost that game. And then they lose to Missouri, who was 5th that year. Remember that. Missouri had a good year that year. They lose by 7 points again. So again, if we remove that one LSU game his sophomore year, they lose 3 games against very good quality opponents by 18 points. Essentially 6 points, a score, or a couple field goals. And so putting that into context, I think matters in terms of, well, Manziel's not a winner, right? I mean, if you look, he has one game where there's no excuse, and the other ones are very close, very competitive. He does his job in both of the bowl games. He held up his end of the bargain against those teams on the offensive end, minus LSU, correct? Had he just had a slightly better defense, Manziel maybe only loses 1 game his sophomore year. And the entire attitude and tone on Manziel versus Vince Young is entirely different. We look at Vince Young, he got smoked by Oklahoma his first year. He gets benched against Washington State in his bowl game his freshman year. They lose 12-0 against Oklahoma the next year. Again, the Texas defense does their job against Oklahoma. They only allow 12 points, and Vince Young puts up a goose egg. He also is benched against Missouri. Technically, he was, I guess, semi kind of knocked out of that game, but again, I showed the article when it was time for him to return. They kept him on the sidelines. That's a bench for all intents and purposes. In a lot of these games, a lot of these big games, correct, or close games, the defense is winning a lot of these games. I went over the Big 12 championship. There are many other games where the Horns are scoring 50, 40, 60 points, and Vince Young just has an average game. The legend and lore of Vince Young comes from the 2 Rose Bowl games, essentially. And for good reason, right? I mean, he dominated those games. He was absolutely incredible. We all know the stats of the USC game. Against that Michigan team, he goes 16 of 28, a decent completion percentage, 180 yards, not too crazy. 1 TD, 1 interception. You know, that's not good technically. But on the ground, again, the lore of Vince Young is these big games on the ground in terms of Michigan and USC. He goes 192 yards on the ground against Michigan and 4 TDs. Really, when you take these 2 games away, if you were to simply remove those 2 games, it's not even close in terms of trying to compare Manziel versus Vince Young. 2 games do not make someone better than someone else's entire body of work, especially when they have been elite. Another thing I wanted to touch on also real quick was the Heisman race, both in 2012 and 2013 for Manziel and 05 for Vince Young. I've heard a lot of people say essentially Manziel went up against nobody in 2012 for his Heisman. It doesn't matter. The reason why it doesn't matter is looking at Manziel's numbers, it was a top 25 all-time performance for a quarterback in terms of yards. Coupled with his 47 total touchdowns and 1,400 yards on the ground for over 5,000 yards, Manziel in any year for the Heisman wins it 90% of the time, especially considering his team only lost 2 games that year. However, looking at the 2005 Heisman, not only did Vince Young not win it, but if you put Manziel in that 2005 Heisman race, he probably beats out Reggie Bush. Reggie Bush had 1,740 yards that year, an 8.7 average, 16 TDs on 200 attempts. His total yardage was 2,541. Remember that. 1,740 yards, 16 TDs on 200 attempts. Manziel, his Heisman year, got 1,410 yards on 201 attempts, the same amount of attempts, and 21 rushing TDs. If you put Johnny Manziel in that 2005 Heisman race, he easily wins it hands down, or at least he should have. Now, again, if they want to just simply vote on who's on the best team and has the most wins, I guess maybe he comes up a little short. But if we're simply just going at stats, what they produce, again, the fact that Johnny Manziel lost his 2 games that year by a total of 8 points, and as a freshman led them to an 11-2 record. Again, Manziel wins the Heisman 90% of the time, no matter who he's going up against. So I just wanted to bring that up. I think it's silly. They're saying, oh, well, he just went up against Manti Te'o. It doesn't matter who he went up against. He easily would win the Heisman 90% of the time in almost any year, especially taking a look at the level of competition that he went up against and the fact that he beat the eventual champion Alabama that year and put 29 points on them in an amazing performance, who had the number 1 ranked defense. I just find the Heisman jabs a little silly. They don't make much sense. And to be clear, Manziel probably should have won the Heisman in 2013 as well. He had about 600 more yards than Jameis Winston, a better completion percentage, more total TDs. He essentially beat Jameis Winston all over the board. But again, Jameis Winston was in the ACC, they run the table, and so he gets the award for being on a better team. And so for all this talk of the Heisman race that Manziel didn't beat anybody, that's beside the point. He statistically was dominant. His freshman year is 21st all-time in total yards for a single season, and even his sophomore year, he's 41st all-time for yards in a single season. And staying on the Alabama argument, in my video I had brought up comparing Alabama to USC, and a lot of people don't seem to understand what I'm doing there. Again, playoff football at this time, 2012 and 13 and 2004 and 2005, is not a thing, right? You simply have a conference championship if you're lucky to play in, and then you have a bowl game, right? Every game during the regular season in college football is a playoff game, essentially. You are fighting for seeding. If you want to be in the championship, you cannot lose a game, let alone two. And so to act as if Alabama, because it was regular season, wasn't taking it seriously, or that because it's a regular season game, the intensity is less or something of that matter, just makes no sense. The reason why I bring up the Alabama game in Manziel's freshman year, again, is to do what we've been doing this whole time. I'm trying to get as good of a comparison as possible in terms of these two quarterbacks. And essentially, people always bring up the Rose Bowl, right? That's the big game. That's the X factor that Vince Young has over Manziel in a way. In my opinion, Manziel's game against Alabama his freshman year in terms of competition, again, we're talking about Bama, who was the eventual champion that year. They go back to back. So again, we have somewhat of a similar situation with USC. They have the number one defense in the country. Again, if we really want to compare apples to apples, correct? USC has the 35th ranked defense and Alabama has the number one ranked defense. In my opinion, I know this is a controversial take, it's a hot take, and if you don't understand what I'm trying to say, then I don't know how else to put it to you. Hopefully you at least understand where I'm coming from, even if you disagree. Johnny Manziel's win, in terms of just a pure quarterback performance, was just as good, if not better, than Vince Young's performance in the Rose Bowl. And for everyone who says, well, the Rose Bowl performance won him the Natty, well, that game was a culmination of a great team beating another great team, right? Again, I've said it earlier and previously, I give Vince Young credit for quote-unquote winning the Rose Bowl, correct? Just as I give Johnny Manziel quote-unquote credit for winning that game against Alabama. And those two other teams, Alabama and USC, they're about as close as we can get to comparing what they did in the biggest moment of their career, or perhaps the biggest win of their career, right? I'm not saying that because they beat Bama, it's like winning a national championship. That's not what I'm saying. That's not the argument. If you're interpreting in that way, then either you just don't get what I'm saying, or I think you're being a little disingenuous. And so we'll just go over the recap one more time. When it comes to the cold hard data and the stats, Johnny Manziel is in another stratosphere compared to Vince Young. I don't think there's any denying that. I think even the biggest Vince Young fan would say, yes, Johnny Manziel's output, statistical output, both in the air and on the ground, are insurmountable in terms of trying to compare Vince Young stats to that. They're very similar on the ground, but again, if Manziel plays one more year, he probably passes up the rushing totals. He definitely passes up the rushing TDs. Vince Young probably edges him out in yards per game, but the rushing totals are very comparable. Essentially, if those are a wash, Manziel is blowing him out of the water in terms of passing and overall output just in his 2 years. Secondly, on average, Manziel played a tougher crop of teams, especially in the ranked teams or the more premier competitors. On average, Manziel is playing about one or two more ranked teams per year, one or two more top 10 teams, one or two more top 10 defenses on average than what Vince Young played against. The strength of schedules are very similar, but again, if we look at just the ranked teams, the top 25, things of that nature, you throw out Rice for Texas and you throw out the non-FBS and the non-Power 5 for A&M, and we just sort of get down to the brass tacks. A&M is playing a harder schedule than what Vince Young did. I think that the lows of Vince Young are lower than anything Manziel had. Manziel essentially has one bad game, one truly bad game on his record. On the other hand, I think Vince Young has several blemishes that are inexcusable. The Holiday Bowl getting benched is not a good look. Getting smoked by Oklahoma 2 years in a row is not a good look in terms of getting blown out. I know it's your first start, but hey, everyone's got to start somewhere. And if you're a winner, then it doesn't matter, right? You should just be a winner and win. He gets smoked by Oklahoma. The next year, he goes up and puts a goose egg on Oklahoma. He also gets benched his sophomore year against Missouri, who was not a good team at the time. The game might have been a little windy or what have you, but at the end of the day, Mac Brown decided to go with Chance Mock over Vince Young. So statistically, I think Manziel is better. His efficiency is better. He played against harder competition on average. I think that the lows of Vince Young are much lower than the lows of Manziel. Now, obviously, Vince Young has the high, right? The one high, it's essentially one game, to be honest with you. Because if we want to sort of compare the Cotton Bowl to the Rose Bowl in 2005, where Vince Young plays Michigan, those are essentially an equal comparison. Manziel actually does better against a 12th ranked Oklahoma team than what Vince Young did against a 13th ranked Michigan team. Against that Michigan team, he's semi-efficient through the air, but really he gets a lot of yards on the ground. He scores 5 total TDs, 1 interception, 372 yards total, a 116 QB rating. Against Oklahoma, again, we're talking about a bowl game in which both teams were ranked 12 and 13 respectively. Oklahoma actually ranked 1 spot higher. Manziel goes 22 of 34, 287 yards through the ground, 4 TDs, 1 interception, a 150 QBR, 229 yards on the ground, 82% of his team's offense. So again, Manziel goes over 500 yards, a 150 QBR, 4 total touchdowns. Essentially, Vince Young has the same in terms of their team's total offense that they produced. He has 5 touchdowns, 1 interception, and gets only 272 yards. So again, even if we want to compare, oh, well, they're such winners, right? I mean, when we really get down to it, we're talking about one game in terms of Vince Young in the 2006 Rose Bowl against USC. And again, all credit to Vince Young, he won that game. But that one game does not make him better than Johnny Manziel. If you take that one game away, the USC game, and I said this in my rebuttal video, if you take that one game away, we're not even having a debate anymore. There's not even a debate in terms of who was better. The averages, the highs, the lows, Manziel wins them all. Throw in the Heisman. I haven't even brought up the Heisman really in terms of an argument. I don't really care about the Heisman. It's not really part of the argument. But hey, throw in the Heisman, the one that Vince Young never got. And there were 3 or 4 other players that were around as good as Vince Young in the Heisman race in 2005 as well. You put Manziel in that class, he beats them all by a mile. Vince Young's efficiency, he's throwing interceptions at almost twice the clip per touchdown and per attempt than Johnny Manziel. Manziel is doing better against top 10 teams, top 10 defenses, top 25. In the bowl games, he comes through huge, puts up monster numbers. He's got an amazing win on his belt in terms of a number 1 Alabama and a number 1 defense. Everywhere you look, Manziel beats Vince Young in almost everything. Quite literally everything, except for the one game, right? And that one game, I don't care who you are, if you are being honest with yourself, that one game does not make Vince Young a better quarterback in college than Johnny Manziel. And I'll go to the total team offense one more time to sort of end this out, because the main argument is Vince Young's winning, correct? How is Vince Young able to just simply have the blanket statement put on him that he is a winner whenever you take out the USC game, correct? He's not even winning half of his games on his own, or is even the main reason why they win. Why does he get that as an argument against Manziel? It doesn't really logically make sense. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny, as we've gone over in this video. Vince Young is no more a winner than Johnny Manziel in all reality. Vince Young just had the luxury of playing on a stacked, loaded team of talent. And again, that team is better than Johnny Manziel's teams. That's not the argument. The defense, the run game, the coaching, it all far surpasses anything Manziel had. I mean, Manziel turned Ryan Swope into a better wide receiver than anything Vince Young could do with his entire wide receiving group. And the bottom line is that one game against USC does not make Vince Young a better quarterback than Johnny Manziel. And again, you take that game out, these guys are essentially nowhere even in the same ballpark with each other. And again, if you take out that one game against USC, if you remove it from your mind, and we go through all the things we've gone through in this video, it's not even close. These guys are not even in the same atmosphere in terms of how much better Manziel was than Vince Young. And I know that seems like a hot take to someone. If you've listened this far and you disagree with me, you're probably pulling your hair out. But again, if you take away that one USC game, what exactly did Vince Young do better than Johnny Manziel? Because you can't really say winning. When people say he was a winner, they're simply talking about the Rose Bowl game against USC. It was such an iconic game, maybe the most iconic college football game of all time. And people take that and they run with it and they extrapolate it to Vince Young's entire career, when in reality, that's just not the truth. It's not even close to the truth in terms of what Vince Young did game in, game out compared to Johnny Manziel. And so with that, I'm going to wrap this video up. I think I have made my point. I think I have proven it. And I will die on this hill, and I truly believe this. Johnny Manziel is and was a better college quarterback than Vince Young ever was. No matter how you look at it, no matter what angle you come at it from, and if all you're going to say is that Vince Young was a winner, you need to explain, you need to elaborate. There has to be more than just some blanket statement so you don't have to really think about it and prove your point. Vince Young was no more a winner than his team was a winner. And he simply doesn't just get to be called better than every other quarterback who maybe didn't win a national title simply because he was on an amazing team and they won. That's not how this works. It's almost like the difference between Trent Dilfer and Peyton Manning. Both of them have rings, correct? But how did they win those rings? What led them to those rings? And while yes, Vince Young performed well in the Rose Bowl, when we actually go back and look at it, he was not putting his team on his back. He was not this statistical juggernaut that was really the powerhouse and the nucleus of his team. It was the run game. It was the defense. And yes, at times it was Vince, but not the way people argue it in terms of him versus Johnny Manziel. And they act as if Johnny Manziel lost those games his sophomore year and even his freshman year. If we throw out that one LSU game, right? One bad game, and I've already brought up how Vince Young had several bad games. So I think it's fair to just say, let's throw out that one LSU game his sophomore year. Manziel lost 6 games by a total of 26 points. That's under 5 points a game. And in most of those games, the defense didn't show up whatsoever. And Johnny played his ass off. So again, I think the winning accolades that are placed upon Vince are super overinflated. I think the lore of the Rose Bowl game has taken over people's memory, and they have not really dived into what Vince Young did on a game-to-game basis. And I think the fact that Manziel lost 6 games in 2 years, again, people don't give it context. All of his losses are about as good of a quality loss as I guess you can get, however you want to put that, right? I'm not excusing the loss, but again, let's give it some detail. Manziel didn't lose to a team that was outside of the top 15. 3 of those losses also came against top 15 defenses. He has one really bad game against LSU his sophomore year. And after that, Manziel shows up every game and essentially gets them the win, or they lose by just a little bit, and we're just asking the defense to make one more play. And so when you look at how Vince Young won, which I've done, it's not all on him. In fact, it's maybe even less than half of him. And you look at how A&M won, it was definitely all Manziel when they won, or at least very much more so than Vince Young. And even when Manziel lost, it's really hard to put the losses on him. So that's my video. This was a fun topic. This was a fun video to make. I put some time and effort into it. So again, if you're sour about this as a UT fan, or if you think I'm crazy, that's fine. But it's just content on sports. If you want to leave a logical or reasonable reply, I'll answer it. But if you're just going to say Aggies suck, or there's no way Manziel could be better than Vince Young, and you don't elaborate or put any thought to it, I don't really care. I'm always open to debate people. I would love to have a second debate on this after I debated my friend, after I've really deep dived into the topic and gone over things in more detail. But if you guys like this video, then leave a like, subscribe to our channel. We'll keep putting out content. Even if you don't like the Aggies, it's fine. We got a couple Longhorn guys on the channel as well, so they'll be putting out Longhorn content also. If you guys like the video, I appreciate the sub. And I'll see you guys on the next one.
Yo, Club.
Club, are you answering?
I can't hear.
We can't hear you.
There's too much money in my fucking head.
I can't hear you.
I can't answer it or not. But I'll call you back.